Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of our participants around the world joining our second webinar today for the 2023. My name is Dev Tavaraja. I am a professor at the Clemson University, oversees the Pulse Quality and Nutritional Grading Program at the Clemson University. Next, I would like to thank you, our sponsors, USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture, NIFA OREI, USAID Feed the Future Innovation Lab from Cornell, South Carolina Department of Agriculture, the Good Food Institute, USDA Agriculture Research Services, USDA ARS. Thank you all for support for our program. And we would welcome today one of the outstanding professors, distinguished professors, one of my teachers at the University of Saskatchewan, Dr. Susan Whiting. She is the distinguished professor of nutrition, University of Saskatchewan, Saskatoon, Canada, which was home for myself as well. Dr. Whiting is a member of the University of Saskatchewan faculty since 1988. She completed her postdoctoral training, medicine renal physiology, at the University of British Columbia, and also she taught in Halifax. She has been known for many things around the globe, especially for dietary DRI intakes and table developments of the nutrient requirements. That's why I was keep talking about her in my class when we talk about the dietary recommendation. She's the member of the Dietitians of Canada, Canadian Society of Nutritional Sciences, the American Society for Nutrition, and the American Public Health Association. She has been supervised, mentored many graduate students, including my husband as well. She taught for 25 years in nutritional programs and has supervised over 20 graduate students in master's and PhD at the University of Saskatchewan. She's a legend. She has been talking about pulse health quality for a long, long time. So I'm very honored to have her in my Going Organic program today. Dr. Whiting, it's your floor.
Oh, thank you very much. That was a wonderful introduction. And I'm just going to turn off my video as I give my presentation because I'm doing this from home and our broadband isn't as good as it could be if I were at the university. So I'm just going to stop my video and share my screen. There we are. It's always that moment of panic when we connect on Zoom with PowerPoint. So I'm going to be talking about benefits and perceived risks of pulse consumption. And I want to use examples not only from Canada, United States, where we would call that the global north, the high income countries, but also from the global south, and introduce you to some of the work we have been doing. Now, I will make a disclosure, and that will justify why I have some global south experience, that for 20 years, we've been working with Ethiopia on various plant-based endeavors, starting with soil science and moving into nutrition. But for 10 years, we were funded by various programs from the government of Canada to do pulse-based research and education. And I guess my disclosure is that we want to continue this work, and we have a application into the government for further funding, and we hope that we will hear about this in the next few months. So my aim today is to present a balanced message on promoting pulses in both the global north and south, looking at how pulses as a food, what the recognition of this and the concerns. For example, in the global north, people haven't been eating pulses as much. It's been a recent development, and some concerns are emerging that I want to discuss. In the global south, people have been eating pulses for a long time, but especially in Ethiopia, there's a processing problem. And also, as the crop itself gets more valuable, people have a tendency to grow it, but not to eat it. They would rather sell it. The nutrition messages between the global north and south are also different. In the north, we look at how a food can reduce the risk of chronic diseases, where countries like Ethiopia still have malnutrition and hidden hunger, which is micronutrient deficiency. I'm going to be showing you the message that we give to in these countries using food guides, Canada and the US, as well as food-based guidelines that have just been developed in Ethiopia. But the bottom line is the same. We want everyone to increase consumption, but I will be giving a few caveats to how we need to tell our message. Now, our first issue is the term pulses. It actually has been a bit of a challenge to use that term. I went to Wikipedia. I know we say to students, don't go there, but I actually like it. It's a very good first look. And the first thing it says under pulses is, well, they're more commonly known as legumes. And in the US, you often use just beans, talk about eating beans. And then crop science is sometimes called pulses grain legumes. And so that can kind of send a funny message to consumers. And I'm not, unfortunately, going to be able to solve this problem. It might help to know that, according to Pulse Canada, the word pulse means a thick soup. So it doesn't have anything to do with your heart rate. It's just maybe knowing that will help you remember. What happened in 2016 was very important for pulses because it was declared the International Year of Pulses, and that word now became much more common. They have this wonderful logo of the spoon with all the different types of beans and peas. And it really became a year of hearing about pulses. And in Canada, we had a top chef talk about different recipes. But just notice at the bottom of the screen, the year of the pulse is more commonly known as legumes. So we're still having this. What do we really want to call these foods? Well, Pulse Canada has a nice diagram. On the top, we see all the components of legumes. We see, soybeans, ground nuts like peanuts, pulses, fresh peas, and fresh beans. And this is where we run into a little bit of trouble, is having these really what we would call vegetables in the whole group. So the pulses themselves, in most organizations, when they talk about pulses, and when they don't talk about pulses, they'll just say, oh, we mean dry peas and beans, lentils, and chickpeas. So those are the common ones that we're going to be looking at. And the reason that they have their own category is that they're high in protein, they're high in fiber, and they're low in fat. And only the chickpea has a small amount of fat. Now, these values are grams per 100 grams of cooked. 100 grams of cooked pulses and maybe a full serving, but it kind of allows us to do a bit of a percentage. So we could say the percent by weight by protein is around 8%, 7 to 8%. Fiber is pretty good at 4 or 5. And fat is very low. And even what's in chickpeas isn't considered different. And so that distinguishes pulses from nuts and seeds and soybeans. Well, here I am at the end of this pink arrow in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. I won't tell you the temperature. I'll tell you the temperature. It's minus 40 with a wind chill. So we're pretty cold in the winter, but in the summer, we have a great growing season. And in our prairie provinces where I live, Saskatchewan, but Alberta and Manitoba, is where the pulses are grown. And I know that many crop scientists from the University of Saskatchewan have participated in this seminar. So you may be familiar, but you can see the richness of our pulse crops. We have a lot of lentils here. We have faba beans, dry peas, and beans, and just a little bit in southern Ontario. So we're really in the center of pulse growing, but nobody eats them. I shouldn't say nobody. slowly over time, people have become to embrace them. But our farmers also view pulses as a cash crop, and they send overseas to many other countries. So it's been an uphill battle to get to recognize pulses as something that people should be eating every day. In fact, here are some data. In Canada, we have the Canadian Community Health Survey, which I think is elsewhere in my slides as CCHS. And it's similar to NHANES in that the 24-hour recall of a large group of representative Canadians is taken. We've only had two complete surveys, 2004 and 2015. And the category here is quite broad, legumes, nuts, and seeds. But the servings per day in 2004 for all ages was 0.3. And even after 11 years of increasing interest in plant-based sources of protein, it's gone up 0.1. So it will be interesting when we do the survey again if we can see a larger increase. But I had my students analyze the values in 2004, a few years ago, and it wasn't that everybody was eating 0.3, it's that a small percentage were eating a lot, and they tended to be ethnic groups on the west coast of our country, coming from Asia primarily. And a lot of people ate none. So we may grow pulses, but we're not at the point of embracing them as a food source. Well, one way that this is changing is how our food guides have changed. Now, the plate has been around for much longer than the Canadian Food Guide, which is here on the left. The plate made the first move to have a protein group rather than a meat and alternative group. And so that made protein sources more on an equal footing and took away the message that, well, if you can't eat meat, maybe you could try something else. And the plate also introduced us to a visual representation of how much of a food group one should be eating. So in 2019, Canada also adopted a plate. It's slightly different. We combine our fruits and vegetables as one large group. And our protein group is here on the top, and our grain group is here below it. Now, the photograph is rather interesting, and it gives people an idea of when we talk about a particular food group, what is it? And it's a representation of both animal and plant-based sources. So a person can see sort of equal representation of both animal and plant proteins. And the pulses themselves are here. You might be able to distinguish a few shapes and colors. All our pulses are in the protein group. Now, when it comes to the US plate, there's a slightly confusing message. First of all, the group is called beans, peas, and lentils, and really the word dried is implied. And there's two ways to count where the pulses could go. If you normally eat meat, poultry, and seafood, then any pulses you consumed could be could or should be classified as a vegetable. It's like, well, you don't need any more protein, but you do need potassium, you need fiber, you need minerals and vitamins. So you can now classify those as a vegetable. However, if you're a vegetarian, a vegan, or you simply don't eat meat, you would count beans, peas, and lentils in the protein group. That is a difficult message to get across, and no longer equates pulses as equally with meat as a source of protein. So it's what you have. Maybe it will change over time, but when we send these confusing messages to consumers, they will remain confused. So the good news, though, with these food guides, despite that small problem I got up, was to not call these plant-based proteins meat alternatives. And that's been a good advance. Now, I do want to talk about the health benefits of pulses, but I'm not going to spend a long time on them because they were covered really well a year or two ago by Jerry Coombs from Tufts University. His whole seminar was on health benefits and going into the design of various studies. I wanted to bring up this book because it has many chapters related to the health benefits of pulses, and I'm going to draw upon it. I wrote two chapters. One that just discussed what I just mentioned to you about dietary guidance, and we looked at various food guides around the world. The Canadian one hadn't quite been released at the time. And then the other one that I worked on was the low-income countries and how pulses are. And that I'm going to spend a bit of time on that aspect. But you can see that there's many chapters on health benefits. There's also a very useful chapter on processing. And I'm going to cover that because that's a bit of an issue when we talk about pulses. So just to summarize the health benefits of pulses, there's really three major ones that are so important. They're important for us in the global north, but even in the south, as we have nutrition transition and chronic diseases are overtaking transmittable diseases and malnutrition in many countries. But the three major benefits are first, that pulses provide increased intake of important nutrients and phytochemicals. So they're a source of protein and fiber, particularly soluble and insoluble both, micronutrients such as folate, iron, zinc, calcium, potassium, and these are missing in the diets in many countries in the global south, but even in North America, people may be low in these. And then there's many bioactives that have health properties. And the evidence is very good using national survey data, whether it's things like NHANES or in Canada, or CCHS. Secondly, there is a lot of good evidence that pulses reduce the risk of chronic disease for cardiovascular, hypertension, colon cancer, and type 2 diabetes. The mechanisms are what pulses bring to the diet: fiber, they're low in fat, they have favorable low sodium and high potassium, and have excellent glycemic properties so that insulin release is not maximized when you consume them. And this little RS is resistant starch. So that's another important component in that pulses bring. And the evidence, as I said, is very good. There's very strong cohort, longitudinal design studies, randomized controlled trials. And then as these trials get published, there's meta-analyses that show decreased risk. And finally, there's a great interest in how pulses can help us with overweight and obesity. A lot of evidence that the fiber content and the protein can increase satiety and reduce overeating and portion size problems that sort of plague the global north. And there may be even a role for pulses in treatment of overweight and obesity. And again, lots of randomized controlled trials. Now, I used the chapter by Mudry in the book I just showed you by Dahl, edited by Dahl. But just to say that in the subsequent years, a lot of research has been done. And these are just examples of how pulses improve nutrient density, how they contribute to cardiometabolic health, how they can attenuate obesity. And then I just found one that was just published in 2023, a whole new initiative from the United Kingdom where they're going to combine not only the nutritional and health benefits of pulses in the UK, but also the environmental positive environmental impact of pulses. So very exciting research. Don't think it's over, but each new study contributes to our knowledge and our confidence that pulses play a very important role. So we're pretty confident that there's many health benefits of pulses. So what I want to spend a little bit of time is why people are being told not to eat them. And these are what we've called over the years anti-nutrients, although what we're finding is many of these, or really all of these compounds can have health benefits as well. So I just want to go through what is being said about these anti-nutrients and how we can deal with them, but also to recognize there may be certain situations where we shouldn't be too enthusiastic about our message that everyone should eat lots of pulses. The public health message is usually that most people should eat, the amount of pulses that have health benefits. So let's start with the FODMAPs. So these fermentable saccharides are present in many plant-based foods, not just in pulses. And the term FODMAP is used to describe diets that are either low FODMAP, and they're prescribed for people who have irritable bowel syndrome. And then this is contrasted with sort of a normal diet that is likely high in these FODMAPs. So I just cut out a portion of a list of foods. You can see it's in alphabetical order. And these are the low FODMAP foods that people with IBS and just having gastrointestinal problems eating various foods. These are the ones that are allowed on the low FODMAP side, and on the high FODMAP side are the foods that should be discouraged and possibly even completely restricted. So yes, some pulses would be allowed, chickpeas, but a fairly small serving. And here, kind of a restriction of beans, black, broad, kidney, lima, and soybeans. Now, one way to reduce the impact of FODMAPs is to properly process the pulses. So as Dal and Alvarez write, canned pulses will have a low content of oligosaccharides if they're soaked and well cooked, fermented, or sprouted. So it's the processing that will eliminate this as a major problem. However, despite the fact that FODMAPs are prebiotic compounds and we encourage people to have fermentable carbohydrates for their microbiome, they can cause GI problems when consumed in excess. And so processing is very important. And for people who actually have IBS and are under the care of a physician, they would need to restrict most of the foods on the high FODMAP side. That would include many of the pulses. The second anti-nutrient is lectin. And I don't know if you've seen ads by Dr. Stephen Gundry. It shows up on my browser now and again, and I did watch his video. And he is very concerned about lectins. He has patients who have problems eating many foods, including pulses, and his answer is to restrict them. He developed the plant paradox diet, which bans all nightshade vegetables, which we eat. They're tomatoes, they're things like that. We eat them all the time. He bans beans, legumes, grains, and most dairy products. And in this, he calls it a paradox because he's saying, oh, you think plants are healthy? I'll show you that they're not. And I'll tell you the ones that you shouldn't be eating. Well, all of us could have an opinion about what his restrictions would mean, but I found Healthline on the internet and it rates diets. And they say, well, if you're lectin sensitive, and some people are, this diet can really bring you back to health. However, for almost everyone else, it's excessively restrictive. It bans nutritious foods, and there's no evidence that lectin is necessarily unhealthy for most people. So the bottom line, we do have to recognize that lectin sensitivity can be real. It affects the GI tract, and Dr. Gundry's patients show up at his door. So he has treated some. One of his case studies on the video is someone who had excessive intakes of pulses. And those are people who hear something is healthy, and therefore it's necessary for them to eat as much as possible. Similar to the FODMAPs, lectins can be reduced by proper soaking, boiling, autoclaving, fermentation, and germination. So again, processing is so important for pulses. The third anti-nutrient is phytate. And we hear about phytate because it's a small compound. It's an inositol that has a phosphate group on every one of the carbons. This creates a very highly negatively charged molecule found in many seed coats, and it binds divalent cations to the point where they can't be absorbed. Now, in this graph, we have two situations, one of a low phytate diet where zinc absorption, when zinc is present in the diet of a human at a level that's below the RDA. And that could be possible. Not everyone eats at the RDA level. If they have a low phytate diet, they're able to absorb most of that zinc. But if they have a high phytate diet and they're low in zinc, they're not absorbing as much. And that can lead to zinc deficiency. Now, when the dietary zinc is higher, the difference between a low and high phytate diet makes no difference. But there are people who restrict their zinc intake by not eating certain animal products like meat, are relying on plant sources that contain phytate. And so having a high phytate diet and a low zinc intake is going to lead to zinc deficiency. That it could happen in the global north, but it's definitely a problem in the global south. So we don't talk too much about phytate as an anti-nutrient. It actually may have beneficial effects in the gut. And North Americans in general don't eat enough fiber to worry too much about it. But in the global south, where people are eating a lot of unrefined grains, and now they're eating pulses with them, they don't eat sources of zinc like meat, then a phytate can have a detrimental effect. And so processing is very important to reduce the phytate. It really is a method to get rid of those excess phosphates. So you're changing from 6 to maybe 2 or 3 phosphates bound to that inositol. The fourth one, polyphenols, may even be surprising to people because we talk about them as wonderful antioxidants. They're the reason we eat chocolate and drink coffee. And yet they can bind divalent cations. And in this case, a study was done showing how a lot of polyphenols in the diet, in the human diet, can change the absorption of iron from normal, it's just 100% of controls, down to 50% less when polyphenols are present in high amounts. And the story, though, is the same as with the other anti-nutrients. Proper processing, cooking and soaking or germination, as shown in this study by our former PhD student, Hiwat, who came to Saskatchewan from Ethiopia and conducted a number of studies looking at home-based food processing. So the cooking and soaking were being done in the homes and the germination was being done in the homes. And she found that you needed soaking of 12 hours and then followed by cooking to reduce either phytate or polyphenols by a significant amount. You don't get rid of all of them, but you get rid of their binding properties almost to 80%. And she found germination required 48 hours. And again, that had a significant impact on phytate and tannins in this case, tannins being a subset of polyphenols. So in the home, in the Ethiopian home, the women are making food, and this requires them to go and get water, soak overnight, and then cook, or to allow for germination for several days. Generally, though, in North America, we rely on an industrial level processing, things like puffing, canning, and extrusion, micronization, and yet also when you're just making a meal from dry beans and peas, you would see instructions to soak and to make sure that you cook at a high temperature. And all of these pulse processing procedures that are nicely described in the Dahl book reduce the anti-nutrients. Most of them, except for soaking, involve some degree of heat. I guess germination, you're just putting it away somewhere to cause the sprouting. But heat is really important to reduce the anti-nutrients. In addition, some of the pulse processing methods reduce cooking time. And that's important when people don't have time. And one of the reasons they might not want to make foods using pulses is a perceived um, inconvenience of having to deal with them. Now, the most common way that we certainly encourage people to consume pulses if they don't want to be involved with things like soaking is to buy canned. Unfortunately, canned does lead to some micronutrient losses, things like the heat sensitive thiamine, but not to the extent that it reduces it significantly. Extrusion, though, is a form of processing that can lead to some losses of amino acids. So we have to be careful with the nature of the extrusion and monitor it. And also, is this using pulses as a source of nutrients, but how important is the amino acid composition? Now, a final perceived risk, and this I have to say just induces laughter every time I read it. And I don't know who these nutritionists are who are agreeing with the statement, but I've seen it several times in several different types of headings. And this one says, the unexpected canned food you need to stop eating. It's so high in sodium. And it is true that many canned pulses can be high in sodium. Not all, there are low sodium products available. But, to actually tell people to not eat them is very irresponsible when the answer is just rinse them. So if people come to you or you've seen concerns raised about the high sodium content of canned beans, peas, and lentils, um, rinsing them is the answer. However, I just want to raise it that it depends on what they want to do with that can. And I found there are some people from different cultures who actually prefer to use the liquid as part of their consumption. And so that's fine too. Yes, sodium can be a problem, but it can be managed. And it's certainly not a reason to stop eating pulses. So unfortunately, canned pulses are not available to the rural poor. They would like to have things already cooked because, as I told you, you have to get the water and you have to get the firewood if you're going to cook. And wouldn't it be wonderful if it just came to your house already ready to consume? So when we look at the global south, we look at pulses in two ways. We look at pulses as a crop. What would the reasons be to encourage production of pulses in countries like Ethiopia? And there are four major reasons. As I mentioned before, it can be a source of income, and that will help the family be able to buy other foods. We're just a bit concerned that they might sell all of their pulses as a cash crop. Secondly, they can plant pulses between growing other crops, intercropping, or often pulses are grown near the house and become the part of the garden of that dwelling. Growing pulses in their fields reduces the need for fertilizer, and in low-income countries, fertilizers are very expensive unless they use sort of a natural fertilizer. And pulses are moderately drought resistant, and in many parts of Ethiopia, for example, when drought is becoming much more common, the farmers who are growing pulses are the ones who are getting crops. On the why are pulses good for nutrition, it's the same as they would be for the global north. They're a great source of minerals. And in many countries, zinc and iron are limiting, but also calcium. Folate is uh, given to women during pregnancy, but it's really important for everyone to have a source of folate. And certainly prior to conception, folate is very important. And then it's an excellent source of protein. Now, it should be combined with a cereal. And since cereals are already consumed in fairly high amounts, we're really talking about having pulses for the lysine that's um, limiting in cereals, and cereals providing the sulfur amino acids together, making complementary proteins. Now, we know that those proteins don't have to be eaten at the same time, but they should be eaten regularly together. When you promote a crop and that crop serves the nutritional needs of the country, then you're promoting nutrition sensitive agriculture. And certainly that was our role for 10 years in Ethiopia. Now, in 2013, people were rather surprised that legumes, including pulses, were eaten in such low amounts while cereals were so high. And one of the surprise of this is that one of their national dishes, shiro, is made from chickpeas. So everyone loves shiro and knows about it. But in terms of eating pulses every day, um, this national survey showed that that wasn't happening with the men and women that were being surveyed. And so more care was taken through the government to promote pulses. Um, for example, in our work, we were looking primarily at complementary foods for infants over the age of 6 months. And we found that many of the complementary foods were merely cereals and had really poor protein quality. So we emphasized, along with other organizations like Alive and Thrive, to have better complementary foods. But in doing so, we had to spend time stressing the need for home-based food processing. And this is just a collage of some of our publications that we've published over the years on complementary foods. And we also looked at the health status of women, and in particular, adolescent girls. And the nice thing about our work, I will say, is that we chose graduate students at our university there, AWASA, and they were the ones who actually went out and did the research. And together, we published and hopefully made an impact on what the government was going to promote. So we promoted home-based processing. However, here's a food scientist at Awasa University where we were, Tedesi Tefera, and he's written this really excellent review article in 2021 talking about the need for more advanced pulse processing technologies, because the home base really isn't going to give the country a better economic goal. And it's likely not going to help the nutritional goals of the whole country, because most of our work was more community based. And he reminds us that most of the processing is very rudimentary, soaking or germination, and that a lot of the responsibility for doing that processing will fell to the women in the house. So there is a need to improve processing throughout the global south. So what does the government say now about pulses in Ethiopia? Well, in 2013, they said there is a need to increase production, a recognition that these are important for the diet. Um, as nutrition advanced by 2016, it was more of a food security message to have year-round availability and access, and pulses were one of the foods that were repeated and highlighted. And now in 2022, there's a food-based dietary guideline, and key message number 2 is to eat legumes, but really they're talking about peas, beans, chickpeas, peas, or lentils. They're talking about pulses, 80 to 120 grams a day. Now, I just want to end with their food-based guidance. They chose not to separate pulses from they chose to separate pulses from animal foods and not combine them because of the need to emphasize that animal foods are still necessary in the diet. Um, Unlike the Lancet EAT that's telling the global north to reduce their intake of animal foods because it is high, in the global south, the intake of animal foods is actually very low, and that people need a source of animal foods several times a week. The message here is to eat 4 different food groups of every meal, but the key message was that this group, including all the pulses, should be eaten every day. And that is saying that people are going to eat staples, the grains as staples. They should have some pulses every day, and that they should have a variety of vegetables and or fruit and healthy cooking fats. It's a wonderful looking diagram. Really proud that they worked on it and now have released it. So just to end, so we can have a bit of time for questions, I hope I've been able to raise some of the sort of communication and concerns that people might have about pulses. We know that there's many benefits, but then we get these anti-nutrient messages that could raise some concerns as people are hearing more and more about pulses as a food. Slightly different from the global south, where people will embrace pulses, but the processing is an impediment, and the fact that they are worth so much, excuse me, could cause people not to consume them themselves. We have in the global north a sort of a chronic disease emphasis, while in the south there still are problems of malnutrition, but generally both north and south need the nutrients that pulses bring. Countries now have food guides. They might not be 100% clear about where pulses fit, as I pointed out, but they are, at least in the global north, saying that plant-based proteins are equal to animal-based proteins in terms of the need for protein in the diet. And in food-based guidelines in the global south, some of the messages to reduce their dependence on eating cereals. So pulses will have a complementary protein. The impact, though, of both messaging is to increase consumption. So I'll stop my slides here and hope that there's some questions that we can discuss.
Thank you so much, Dr. Whiting. That was a great, great talk. I have lots of questions, and I'll give you a minute to. I wanted to start this discussion because Global South, Global North, we all want to eat more pulses. We have two different kinds of diseases: micronutrient malnutrition and obesity, overweight, cardiovascular diseases in our parts of the country. But we are facing an issue. I see that you actually working in the Good Food, the Chef Good Food, and the Station 20. What is your thoughts on increasing pulse consumption or changing the consumer behavior towards the positive attitude of pulses to North America? Like what kind of approaches we can use, especially for southern parts of the US here. They eat cowpeas, but that's it. Like, what about the other pulses?
Right. You have to use every opportunity, and you have to look at what they're already exposed to. So someone with sort of a European background might be used to things like baked beans, just as an example. Or now that Mexican or Tex-Mex foods are so popular, people see refried beans and they see haircut beans in other dishes. That I think you have to start with the familiar foods and then introduce more. What our CHEP program is a feeding children in school and introducing children to foods in a way that it's interesting for them. There's actually two approaches. One has been to hide them, like you put black beans in brownies, for example, and nobody knows they're there. But the other way is to introduce those foods when children are young as normal and just tasty. And some initiatives have been taken. And, the worst pushback, though, I'll tell you, is the food service people do not like soaking beans. And so I don't know if you can necessarily introduce pulses in a setting where you're asking cooks and others to do a lot of extra work because they'll give you the pushback more than the children will.
That is a great answer. Maybe we should start as researchers, like we breed
Yeah.
crops, but we need to send this to the end consumers. Maybe we should start making brownies and distribute it and start. Like I heard this when I was in Saskatchewan that you were doing with the school children. That was amazing. And the next thing I want to touch base with Dr. Gandhi's propaganda, or I
Yeah.
don't know. He's a big celebrity doctor, and I get all the time this question about lentils and my lentils and lectins.
Hmm.
And the answer I give Dr. Whiting, maybe you can help me out with. But isn't this lectin get destroyed even though they are very small amount? The way how the traditional cooking, they soak it and cook it for a certain time period, isn't that lectin going to be destroyed?
Yeah. Yes. And so when I watched his video, he bases all of this on a very fairly small number of patients, some of which may, for other reasons, have they maybe I shouldn't get into too many medical things, but intestinal damage. But the one case that sticks out in my mind is a woman who just was eating huge amounts. And I have friends at my age who give halo effects to foods. And we saw this with coconut oil. When coconut oil was, another celebrity doctor was talking about it, I had friends who were like, well, a little bit must be is good, so a lot must be really healthy. And people were really consuming a huge amount for no gain. So when we give foods a halo, people take it as permission to consume in just huge amounts. Now, I'm not saying that we have to have a message of restricting, but really, um, in I mean, you're right that there's most of the lectins are gone with proper processing, but he just has those few uh, cases, and they probably get talked about over and over again. He had to. It's interesting though. He did have to walk back his message about nightshade vegetables.
Right.
So, if someone said, I'm going to feed you nightshades, I might get worried because, you read Gothic novels and somehow it's connected to a poison. And yet they're what, they're what we eat all the time, tomatoes. So uh,
Yeah.
it's a really hard message. Yeah.
It's a really hard message, and also it get confused the people. So
Yeah.
I always say that just if you're a person from Southeast Asia, we know how to cook our lentils and
Yeah.
peas, and that's where we grow up. So, and my next question to link to the lectins, most of the new cultivars that we release is very low in phytic acid, like the phytates, and
Mhm.
they
Yeah.
were not GMO'd or anything like with the
Mhm.
conventional breeding, especially from the Canadian program, Dr. Bird's
Right.
lentils, like less than 200 milligrams of per gram of the phytates. And so I was worried that people still concerned about phytate, and we have to keep certain amount of phytate in the plant
Mhm.
just for the plant survival. So I don't know whether you have any more thoughts on
So,
communicating people.
yeah, I mean, that's why I like to make the distinction between global north and south is we're constantly trying to raise dietary fiber intake through whatever mechanism, whole grains and pulses and legumes and vegetables. And so we don't consume a lot of phytate, where the global south, they are eating highly unrefined. Um, and because they're divalent cations like zinc and iron and even calcium are low, there seems to be some effect that phytate has. But the simple cooking and soaking and cooking reduce it by almost 80%. So I brought it up because it's sometimes called an anti-nutrient, but it's an anti-nutrient in agriculture. Certain animals are highly sensitive to phytate, but it's not so bad for humans, and it probably has a health benefit somewhere along the line. We don't need the phosphates from it, but there may be ways that it feeds microbiomes or something. So
Yeah,
yeah, I don't think I think, as you mentioned, lectin is sort of getting its day right now. I think most people, though, would view polyphenols as being highly beneficial. And so if somehow we took their halo effect and added it to lectins and said, these anti-nutrients aren't really so bad.
right.
Yeah,
Yeah. So now
group them together. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. You have to use, I don't know, there's a lot of information. You need to get it right and talk to experts like you, Dr. Combs, and you are the major experts in the world. So, yeah, people need to listen to more of your talks. Now I'm going to move to the questions from the audience. There's a lot of questions coming out, Dr. Wyden, and we have time. One of the first questions that I wanted to talk to you from one of the economists, Dr. Dave Lemon from Clemson University. He's passionate about pulses, and he actually cooking a pot of Cuban beans right now for
Mm.
lunch. So he's asking this question: what are your thoughts on potential for introducing a broader array of pulses? He's talking about heirloom, land races, which has different textures, taste, color, and he's asking how these can incorporate into the consumers for more offerings.
Well, uh, sometimes introducing new ways and new colors or textures is exciting for the consumer, and sometimes they don't like change. The introduction of orange flesh sweet potatoes throughout Africa was met with resistance. And I just happened to be in Ethiopia and listening to people say, I'll never eat that orange one. And you're saying, oh my goodness, it's got vitamin A in it. It's really good. There's a paper in my collage by a student named Alemna. And we were shocked, actually. We went to an area in Ethiopia, and we found that people there will not eat red haricot beans. Or if they eat them in private because of the stigma of eating red. They will eat white, but they won't eat red. And this, drove our principal investigator through the roof because as a Jamaican woman, red beans and rice are a national dish. So she was insulted. But it was really a lesson in stigma or just not liking something different. In that case, though, it wasn't something different. It was the fact that they were more accessible and therefore the food of the poor.
Yeah,
So, be careful when you think you're doing a favor and, but I think different colors are wonderful because with those colors come um, things like carotenes. And there's, I would have said 10 years ago, there's no carotenes in pulses. What are you talking about? And then was proven wrong. So I'm happy to be proven wrong. So yeah, sometimes with color comes, just health benefits and more different kinds of bioactives. So I think if it's done in a fun way and not to for and maybe children would respond to different colors. It's all very possible. Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely. Even our diversity panel, we have dark green, dark, like mean the green, mean the leaf color green, and then yellow, and then red, orange, and then black and brown.
Mhm.
It's all based on the carotenoid content. And
Yeah.
uh,
Oh,
it's amazing how range of genetic diversity on these crops. Especially for lentils, we have very different colors, size.
Mhm.
Yeah. Okay, so here's another question from one of your students. He's asking, Tama is asking, the debate about pulses as a whole food versus as ingredient. What is your opinion on eating as a whole food or isolating its ingredient as a protein?
Good point. I mean, as a sort of a consumer and a public health nutrition person, I'm more interested in encouraging people to eat it as a whole food. That said, I forgot to make a declaration that my daughter now works for a company that is fractionating peas, Sunnydale Foods. She just got a job. It's just new for her. And I guess that this idea of pea protein as a source of protein. Uh, One of the things I find as a consumer and as I'm getting older is the need to have protein at every meal. And I don't necessarily want to have a dinner food for breakfast. So I might want to choose a cereal-based cereal, a grain-based cereal, um, and have 10 grams of protein per serving. And that 10 grams might come from, pea protein or some other protein. So, they're definitely in the marketplace room for both. But I think it's nice to have people view pulses as a food source, to embrace foods from different cultures, and um, as we are asking or recommending people reduce their meat consumption for many reasons, health and also environment, I think they want to eat food. And if you look at the United Kingdom with the immigrants that have moved there over the last 30 or 40 years, it was a country that had the worst food in the world. And now people go to pubs or restaurants and they have a variety of foods brought to them by, Asian and East Indian immigrants. And I think curry is like one of their favorite meals. So it sometimes takes a while. One of the things that I've started to do, because I think there's not enough recipes, is I'll take a recipe and I'll immediately add a can of chickpeas to it, just because I want to increase the pulses, I want to increase the protein, I want more satiety, and I find that it doesn't add a lot of flavor. It just makes it just a much better meal, and I've been doing that, a lot lately. But it's just one of our problems when I first arrived in Saskatchewan and was really being introduced to pulses in the 80s. They weren't really talked about much. Is I said, where are your recipes? And Pulse Canada and other organizations have really stepped forward and come up with delicious recipes that either incorporate pulses or actually are centered on them. So I think that's been a big improvement. Yeah.
We have 2 minutes left, but I wanted to ask this question. This is one of my colleagues, Dr. Hilda from Rwanda. Probably you know her. She's passionate pulse scientist and working in Rwanda, try to increase the food system. She has 2 questions. At least I'll ask one question because of the time limited. When the bean prices scale up, what would be the alternative source of protein in the global south? Because I think bean prices are going high. So she's wondering what would be the alternative source for that.
Well, I know that people are working on crops that aren't being used very often. Dr. Tedeschi Tefera, whose review article I showed, he wrote me a while ago saying that he was looking at lupins. And I think there's a lot of problems with lupins, maybe from either uh, they need more processing, but many countries are looking around at sources of food that are more local that aren't being utilized and looking at those. The other thing is that the ratio of cereal to pulses might be examined. Right now, with the complementary foods, we were saying 2/3 cereal, 1/3 pulse. Maybe it could be 3/4, 1/4, and still give you a lot of the benefits for complementary protein. So that's what people have started to do as meat prices rose, is they would just eat less of that particular food and more of others. But I think looking at different kinds of pulses, because as soon as something gets very, very desired, like a chickpea, then the price goes up.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Wyden. It was such an interesting, great talk that, oh, I get so excited when we talk about pulses and health, and this is our life. So
Yeah.
um, I'm heartily thank you so much for giving your knowledge, and I'm hoping to meet you here at the Clemson on June 17th, and we'll make arrangement for you to come and talk to our students. Um, so thank you so much. Our next presentation is on March 29th, and there's another global expert on the food system and food system transformation, Dr. Hannah Santon actually she's from Cornell and she is in Netherlands. And she's going to join us from Netherlands and would love to see you all back in March 29th. Thank you so much, and we will see you again soon.